A representative from the Motor Trades Association. Information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and evidence has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today. And welcome, of course.
Thank you, Chair. Richard Dudley, Chief Executive Officer of the Motor Trades Association of Australia.
Thank you, Mr Dudley. I'd now like to invite you to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of your remarks, I'll ask questions.
Given your desire, Chair, to try and get the agenda back on time, we'll just constrain our opening statement to a reference to to our submission, noting the fact that the testimony that's been provided here today has not done anything to change our attitude as expressed in that submission, that the execution of General Motors Holden's decision to vacate the Australasian market has comprehensively illustrated in our mind our ongoing cause for some further specific intervention through legislation and or regulation in the Australian retail market. We also think, based on the testimony provided today so far, that the decision of General Motors Holden and its behaviours still serve as an ultimate exemplar of the manifestation of the power imbalance that exists between motor vehicle car manufacturers and also dealers. It's interesting to note that the 950 direct employees and the thousands of employees who were impacted by the decision to cease manufacturing, as unfortunate as that was, at least had an opportunity of 4 years to get used to the idea, had an opportunity to plan effectively alternatives, and had an opportunity also to be able to absorb that decision and to properly have some time to construct plans for the future. Unfortunately, 4 months is all that was given to the dealers, who are often forgotten. The retail part of the automotive sector is often forgotten, and this is another illustration of that. Happy to take questions, Chair.
Louise, I think you're on mute.
Yes, sorry. Senator McGrath, did you want to kick off? My apologies.
No, it's all good. Just thank you for coming along today and for your submission. And as you mentioned, nothing that you've heard today has effectively changed your position in relation to the power imbalance, amongst other issues. What are your member organisations, in terms of what are the members of your member organisations saying in relation to how the manufacturers treat, the retailers? In terms of, we've heard evidence, or I've spoken to dealers, and they talk about fear, for example, and that's one of the reasons why some dealers have not wanted to come along today, because of the perception of fear or of fear itself. Are you able to expand upon that on behalf of your member organisations and their members in relation to why they might feel that and the impact that might have on their businesses? Absolutely.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. And through you, Chair, one of the tenements of why we've been seeking for more than 20 years stronger protections for car dealers under the Franchising Code of Conduct has been because of the nature of some manufacturers, not all, some manufacturers in terms of their interpretation of the issue of good faith negotiations, what that means, what it looks like, and how it's executed. There is a genuine fear that's not based on hearsay or innuendo, but based on fact, that some car manufacturers historically have treated very poorly their dealer network and their dealer franchise members. That has led to a fear of retribution, either in not having that business restored or renewed, more appropriately, and a fear of saying anything out of order that could be perceived as being something that could be used against them at a later date. It is certainly true that we've seen a changing attitude from some dealers in recent times. So at the recent joint parliamentary inquiry into franchising, We had, for the first time in over 20 years, dealers front up to that particular inquiry and present evidence. Such was their concern over treatment by some manufacturers in terms of their dealership arrangements. Again, we've seen here today, and as evidenced by the submissions received by the committee to date, dealers have come forward again to express without fear or favour their views on how they've been treated as part of this process of General Motors' decision to vacate the Australasian market. So there is substance to the fear aspect. There is continuing fear among dealers because of the nature of the relationship, the power imbalance in the relationship, and the fact that what were once very positive relationships can turn sour overnight.
Has this, you mentioned, for 20 years you've been advocating for change, but in terms of the relationship between manufacturers and retailers, has that, I'm just touching upon your previous point, that's deteriorated more recently, in say the last 5-10 years? Is there a reason why that's come about, or has it just been a slow decline?
It's like a yo-yo. Some previous manufacturers who had very excellent relationship with their dealer network, for whatever reason, it could be attributed to sliding market share in this particular market. It could be to a number of other factors. It could be to poor product development or product that's not attractive to consumers, etc. You can see that relationship change. So you may have had a situation where there were terrific relationships between dealer networks and the car manufacturer, and you've seen that suddenly change. In other terms, you've seen ones that were bad become much better because they've seen the value of the relationship and the intersect between consumers through a dealer network, as well as other methodologies of selling motor vehicles.
And one of the points in your submission relates to your position is essentially that it's on page 4 of your submission. The commercial decision of GMH to cease right-hand drive vehicle production is not in question. You've got questions in relation to the timing of that decision, and that's been addressed here today. Why is the timing so important in terms in terms of, for those who might be listening at home? Why is that so relevant to your member organisations and their members?
I think what's not widely understood is the commitment that an individual dealer makes to that business. So having been selected by the manufacturer to be a representation of that brand in a given location, that dealer's exposure can include the family home. It can include every asset that dealer has to their personal name as well as their business name, to provide the financial security and collateral for that relationship, etc. So very serious decisions are made by individuals who become car dealers in this nation before embarking upon that pathway. The issue then becomes, you do that on the assumption of what's been disclosed. You do that on the assumption of the good faith negotiations that may have occurred at the start of that relationship. You do so armed with as much information as you can possibly gather in terms of making a proper decision about whether to invest, not invest, etc. The problem then becomes if those metrics change unilaterally during the course of what was understood to be the playing field, then suddenly people's homes become seriously placed into question. You've heard evidence through the committee this morning, through you, Chair, that there are serious issues regarding mental health, anguish, anxiety, etc. with many dealers as a result of what they believed was a fair and reasonable relationship that they may have had with General Motors Holden for decades, and in some cases almost as long as Holden itself has been in this country. And to see that change on the 17th of February overnight, and then to be seemingly powerless to have any sort of discussion with those that have made the decision, is what's at the heart of this issue and what we must ensure is not repeated.
Okay. I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Can I ask, in the context of business value, and business value, I think that's outside a franchisor's, franchisees and franchisors' control. There's some discussion this morning about the extent to which the writing would have been seen to be on the wall for Holden dealerships as soon as leading into the decision for Holden to stop, for GM to stop manufacturing Colorado. I can understand why they would have had a dominant place in the market. So clearly that Holden have said that decision, they didn't need to translate the ramifications of that decision through to dealers before it actually happened, despite the fact that it does appear that there was a clear link between that decision and the ultimate decision to exit the market, and therefore the value of a Holden dealership. How do you see, in a franchise context, a just way of those kinds of issues playing out? Should it simply have been a matter of coming clean about decisions that were happening deeper in the company so that there was a greater length of time for Holden dealerships in Australia to manage those issues?
This comes down to, through you, Chair, to you, Chair, this comes down to a number of matters which have been partially addressed in the new schedule of amendments to the franchising code, and that includes a greater disclosure and greater specificity of disclosure. For example, we have dealers who have told us about situations that have been buried within the operations and procedure manuals attached to the franchise agreement, but not necessarily previously disclosed, about how when it comes time to upgrade their facility, they are to use tiles that emanate out of a supplier from Italy, that furniture is to be provided by a supplier from another location or a preferred supplier. We're not objecting to those being the requirements to get a consistent look and feel to a dealership by a particular manufacturer. What we object to is that that's dropped on a dealer as part of undisclosed issues at the time of undertaking the upgrade of the facilities. We sought to actually have some improvements made in the schedule of amendments, and there is a new provision that says and calls for greater specificity, although we'd argue it probably is going to be up to us on behalf of our dealer members to test that provision when the time comes. In terms of the quantum of your question regarding the amount of information that's provided and how it should be provided, we understand the commerciality that exists, particularly between fierce competitors in the car market. Australia is arguably the fiercest, most volatile right-hand drive market in the world. There is a significant amount of competition with more than 67 brands and 400 model variants of those brands, although I might add you'll be very lucky to find any of them at the moment because we think there's a 3 to 6 month wait time on just about everything at the moment. But that in itself means that there are commercial decisions, commerciality, which needs to be respected. However, I come back to my opening statement on behalf of my members and constituents, and that is, if it's good enough to give 4 years' notice to close down a manufacturing plant, why is it not good enough to actually give the almost 9,000 people who are employed in dealerships, 185 of them across the country at 203 sites, even half that time, so that they can absorb the criticality of actually deciding to shut down a brand, to take away their business lifeline, to look at other opportunities where they might be able to continue business, and to de-link an issue such as providing a service agreement that should never have been part of a compensation matter. You know, it should never have been part of that compensation arrangement because, frankly, we are very concerned about some of the clauses, terms and conditions that are in that service agreement. But, of course, our dealers were focused on the issue of the compensation, not necessarily this bolt-on the side, which is, oh, and by the way, you'll continue to be a Holden service provider. Well, that's
What
great.
problems do you foresee in former dealers continuing to be a service provider? What problems do you foresee will come up for the dealers who are now just providing service, and perhaps problems also for consumers? What can you foresee? Holden have given us their assurances today that those commitments will be met. And some of them are covered under consumer law because that's the nature of the contract, but they don't have a lot of capital or vested interest left here to protect.
Well, it's interesting. I think a comment was made that the servicing of a vehicle for an average dealer constitutes 115%, if my memory serves me correctly, and I'll have to go back on Hansard to look at that figure. But if that's the case, then servicing and the warranty upkeep and the safety obligations on a motor vehicle, a Holden owner, is still paramount. And yet, as part of this process, you've had a dealer under duress, I would argue, not only have to consider the compensatory arrangements, but also consider what their business might look like going forward. Now, you could say, well, that's their bad luck. They should have done more due diligence on taking a look at a service contract. But the problem with that is everyone was quite rightly focused on whether their business will survive or not, and whether they would get adequate, fair and reasonable compensation for the decision that's been made. And by the way, you'll get a service arrangement on top of that. To actually have a clause in there, Chair, that says this isn't a franchising agreement makes your eyebrows raise.
Can I ask, in that context, how do we as a committee, in terms of looking at these issues, ensure that the liability for delivering on that consumer product remains with GM rather than being transferred to these Holden dealers simply because they've chosen to take up this compensation scheme? It's been marketed as a positive thing as part of the compensation scheme, where they'll continue to make money rather than a liability. But how do we monitor that?
There's several ways, and our submission goes to some of those points. There will be some discussions by Consumer Affairs Ministers, we understand, later this year, which goes to the heart of warranty and warranty protections and warranty obligations. Our understanding is that they need to be tightened. There's often, we have an issue with the description of distributor as a definition at the moment. We would not regard, even though we can understand why they're known as a distributor, we would not regard car dealers as being a distributor of product. They are a seller of product, but you cannot have a definition which then is used by some manufacturers to abscond from their responsibilities and accountabilities to not only make sure that warranty and safety recalls and all the other obligations under ACL are adhered to, but then we don't have ongoing fights with those same manufacturers about whether they're going to compensate the people that they've elected to service their product on their behalf adequately and fairly. And we have many examples of where that has been the case, even under existing rules and regulations. So our suggestion would be that be tightened up, and that can be through the new schedule of amendments to the franchising code, or indeed under the ACL.
With amendments to the franchising code and franchising law, as other parliamentary committees have looked at, in terms of the suggested things come through that process, how much of the current state of affairs and the problems associated with it could have been mitigated if those things had been implemented earlier, in terms of, for example, mandating arbitration and binding arbitration and those kinds of issues?
It would have served that many of the disputes, many of the issues may not have necessarily have been, would have occurred had those been in place a long time ago. I mean, the Motor Trades Association of Australia and its members have been advocating since 1994, if not earlier, regarding adequate inclusion because of the nature of new car retailing. We are talking about highly complex products that invariably cost the second largest single purchase item, and it is also the situation that there are significant warranty service obligations on those highly complex products, and the nature of the relationship between car manufacturers and the dealers is such on those products that you require a different attitude. Now, we understand that you can't have rules just for one industry out of an entire section, out of the entire economy, but there are ways that could have been dealt with much earlier. And we're thankful that there is now a schedule of amendments that is specific to car dealers. Our argument now is that now that that legislative instrument exists, it's within the realms of policymakers to be able to address some of these critical issues, as illustrated by Holden and its departure from, General Motors and its departure from Australia. Some of those issues can be addressed in that new legislative instrument.
You're advocating that they could be addressed within the current negotiations with from Holden and dealers because that instrument's, pretty ready to go. Do you think Holden was motivated to put pressure on dealers to get this done before that instrument was ready?
I can't pretend for a moment to even put myself in the shoes of what Holden was thinking or trying to achieve through this process, other than the fact that had these provisions existed some time ago, it may have required a different train of thought in terms of exiting a market. And likewise, what we have to try and do is to prevent this from happening again. Now, that's not to maintain a status quo. It is all about being able to allow businesses to adapt, businesses to change, for new business models to be explored, etc. But taking into account the very serious obligations they have to the communities of Australia, to the businesses that have been established and have invested quite significantly in those businesses. We have regional centres, in the committee heard from one of those just prior to the luncheon adjournment, where that business, and we can repeat these right around the country, where in particular in regional and rural Australia, the role of a car dealer in that community is not very well understood. It's not just sponsorship of sporting teams, it's the provision of motor vehicles to charity groups, it's the provision of motor vehicles to health and allied services. It's entwined into the DNA of that community. You take that out, and I'll give you as an example, there is a Holden dealer in the Western Districts of New South Wales in a town that has 900 people in it. We refer to it in our submission. That dealership employs 20-odd people, but the ring effect around that business is that there are other businesses in that community that are interconnected and interrelated to that business. You take them out, and suddenly you see economies start to falter. And that's our concern. It's not about multinational companies not being able to make decisions, but respecting the fact that there are laws in this land that they should abide by, and they should not thumb their nose up at it.
My last question before I hand over to Senator Faruqi. In terms of this committee's findings and Parliament and government's leverage over the existing situation as it stands, do you think we can still influence? Because, Holden isn't going to have a lot of vested interest left here, so we've really got to work out what leverage we do have.
Chair, it depends on which page of Holden's submission you're looking at. On the one hand, they've vacated the market. On the other hand, they're still going to potentially retail products here through a special vehicles arrangement, and they have an ongoing obligation to Australian consumers, 1.6 million, I think. The bottom line is that I think the decision can't be reversed, obviously. The way and means in which it's been handled can't be reversed, but there are lessons to be learned for anyone else, and we are already seeing other car manufacturers looking at this situation in terms of whether there might be other options available to them to avoid the regulatory requirements, if I can be blunt, on what's required under the existing franchising code, let alone what may come out of this committee's deliberations and other actions that we're advocating for.
Thank you. Faruqi.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Mr. Dudley. Thank you for coming in today. On page 4 of your submission, you mentioned that 9,000 employees are likely to be
I'm sorry,
affected.
Senator Faruqi, we seem to have a little bit of feedback this time. We didn't have that earlier today.
Oh, and I'm very quiet, no one, door closed. I'm not sure what's going on. Is this a bit better?
Have a look.
Okay, I'll start it, see if that helps. No, just quickly refresh. Okay, try that better. No.
No, I think I can hear you fine. And Louise, you're
Perhaps if you turn your volume down, Senator Faruqi, we might get slightly less feedback.
Okay, I'll try that. Okay, still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I just wanted to bring you back to your submission, Mr. Dudley. And you say out of the 9,000 dealership employees who are likely to be affected, there are about 555 apprentices as well. So I'd just like you to elaborate a little bit on what effect do you think will be on the apprentices, and how can the government better support apprentices in the industry?
Our concern about the apprentices, how many of them will stay under the revised arrangements going forward. So obviously for those dealers who have elected to continue as a service provider for warranty and other obligations and normal servicing requirements for Holden vehicles, one hopes that those apprentices will be kept on to perform those tasks, etc. Although I think it's too early for us to be able to categorically say whether that's going to be the case or not. From the understanding we have of our dealers, whilst many of them may have other franchises, etc., as I'm sure the committee is aware, there's the straightforward apprenticeship training, and then there'll be some specialisation that will occur, particularly for the type of brand and the type of vehicle that may exist that they're working on. So a number of our dealers, particularly in Victoria at the moment, are battling even the retention of staff full stop, let alone their apprentices and others because of COVID-19. But we would expect to have a better handle probably by the third quarter of this financial year, i.e. sometime between January and March next year, about how the new service arrangements are bedding down and what that might look like in terms of apprenticeship retention by those Holden service providers.
Is there anything that the government can do to support the apprentices now and not wait till, there are no jobs or positions available?
We believe that the initiatives under going forward is that there needs to be a re-engagement of industry and including industry associations because of our proximity to the industry at the grassroots level about what's needed in terms of apprentice training and training and development, and we're pleased that we're able to engage with government on those fronts and have been for some time. Although we believe that there is still an even greater opportunity in a post-COVID-19 environment, as well as a post-Holden decision environment, for industry to be more heavily involved in terms of looking at opportunities for securing greater numbers of apprentices going forward in an industry that's rapidly changing.
Like you, Dudley, there is a concern the way Holden's departure has been managed could be a test case when other brands withdraw as well. And there is quite a bit of concern that this sets, a precedence which should change really. And I heard you suggesting a number of things that governments could do, like, change the notice period, make it longer, changes in the franchise code. So I'm just wondering if there are any other key things you'd like this committee to know that need to be changed from the government's end to make sure that, we can prevent this from happening, and especially to industries which have got like billions of dollars of public money.
It's absolutely essential that multinational, internationally headquartered companies who make decisions impacting their business operations in Australia, but will continue to actually sell their product elsewhere, are held to more account for those decisions in the Australian context. This is not to prevent them from making decisions, but to have a regulatory and obligations framework which makes it quite clear what the expectations of the government, of the Australian people and of the industry are in terms of them selling, those companies selling product in this country. If we have an opportunity to tighten the protections for the Australian businesses and Australian jobs in that context, then it's a cost of doing business and it's a cost of selling product in this country. And it shouldn't be at the point of being overburdened with regulations, etc., but finding the correct balance between what recognises the needs of big business to be able to continue to operate successfully and profitably, but also recognising there is just as much right for a small to medium-sized enterprise in Australia and the communities that rely on those to be able to do exactly the same thing.
Thank you. That's all from me, Chair.
Senator Pratt? We can't hear you. No.
Thank you. Were there any further questions? I want to thank you, Mr. Dudley, for enabling us to change the hearing around a little bit to facilitate our progress. We'd welcome any further insights that you have during the course of the inquiry. Did you have anything else, Senator McGrath, before I let Mr. Dudley go?
I'm good, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Dudley, thank you. Your evidence has been very helpful this afternoon. And I'm sure we'll be hearing from the Motor Trade Association again during the course of the inquiry.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Senators.
Thank you. I believe we